So this is beyond the numbers, communicating the value of sustainable design. The biggest barrier to structural sustainable design often isn't technical feasibility, it's communication. How do you explain the importance of GWP to a client focused on ROI? How do you visualize trade-offs for a design team overwhelmed by choices? This session focuses on the vital translation skills every structural engineer needs today. Our communication experts will demonstrate how to pivot from technical analysis to persuasive storytelling, utilizing both high-impact graphics and targeted verbal communication to champion sustainability at every stage of the project. So we have two presenters for our session who will speak for about 12 minutes each, and then we'll have a short Q&A session following. Our first presenter is Alex Yanchenko. Alex is an architectural researcher passionate about the intersection of data, storytelling, and design. She has recently attained a graduate degree in political architecture from the Royal Danish Academy in Copenhagen, where her work engaged with the Swedish wood supply chain and envisioning a post-growth future for the building sector. Previously a building performance analyst with a background in LCA and all things carbon, she is currently the sustainable design strategist at EHDD in San Francisco. Our second presenter is Orla Smith Lopiccolo, who is a registered architect, professor, and former chair of the Department of Architecture and Construction Management at Farmingdale State College, SUNY. She holds architecture degrees from Trinity College, Dublin, and the Dublin Institute of Technology, along with postgraduate credentials from NYIT and NYU, and is a certified Passive House designer through the Passive House Institute. Her experience spans architecture, construction management, and urban community development. She is a recipient of multiple professional awards and has authored over 20 scholarly papers on sustainable construction, pedagogy, and the use of storytelling in architectural education, and is an inaugural SUNY Sustainability Faculty Fellow. I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thanks, Brenna, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for having me here. As Brenna mentioned, I am an architect, so expect a lot of pretty graphics in my presentation. I'm going to talk to you about charts and how to make them good. So the overall conversation will be about the intersection of data and storytelling. So as Brenna mentioned, I'm currently back on the West Coast in San Francisco, but my journey has taken me here through Denmark, where I was pursuing a degree and practicing with affirmative effect and got to learn a little bit about what our friends and allies over the pond are doing. But before that, I was in Seattle working with Miller Hull as a building performance analyst. Today, I want to talk to you about creating trustworthy and impactful stories using data visualization. And in particular, I'm going to focus on these three questions. What really happens when we set out to tell a story with data? How can we hold our audience's attention when we start telling that story? And finally, the meat of the presentation, what are some rules of thumb for creating trustworthy data visuals? Before I really launch into it, though, I want to give credit where credit is due, because many of the ideas in this presentation come from RJ Andrews' book called Info We Trust, and a remastered version of this book just came out this last year. Please go to RJ's website, Info We Trust, and you can also check out his Substack for some really inspirational content about making trustworthy data stories. I'm going to start with this guy. Have you guys heard about Joseph Campbell? Campbell, he was a writer and scholar who worked in comparative mythology, and he popularized the term the hero cycle, the idea that many mythic narratives that pertain in our persist in our civilization are really variations of a single story. In 1988, he did a documentary called The Power of Myth, which you can access nowadays via just getting it from your library. And just want to give him a shout out because Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Batman, classic Disney, we wouldn't have these without Campbell's influence. The reason I want to talk about the hero cycle is because I think it actually pertains to probing data. There's a point where here you are, you're a superwoman, superman, and you feel a call to adventure, to venture from the known world into the unknown world. There's a stage of initiation where you will be battling your data, ordeals will be endured, a victory is won. But importantly, the hero has to return back to your fellow community with new boons and treasures, come back from the unknown world to bring something to the people around us. Data storytelling in this way is an ongoing act. It's a constant cycle between turning data into information, probing data to humanize, or rather, we start with the world. We have to base everything in the real world. The real world produces data for us to analyze. We can humanize that data by creating stories and putting it literally in formation. Go back to our data and probe it for more insights. But ultimately, the point is that we return home with new boons and treasures, that the information that we get out of our data sets changes the world. And this process is constantly iterating as you are creating your charts and graphics. I work with a lot of life cycle assessment data these days. So I pour through tables that report global warming potential, like Anthony just showed the Canadian standard. Those are things that are kind of bread and butter for me. But the thing is that it's really important to ground ourselves in what all of this means. In the everyday churn, it's sometimes hard to remember that data is really like a music recording. It's a way to bring the past back to life, something that really happened somewhere. This is the San Rafael Rock Quarry, which is just maybe 10 miles north of where I'm sitting right now. The data that I see in a GWP table is ultimately referring back to the actions of somebody driving a machine, literally changing the landscape to extract materials. Just like a music recording, data is not the main event. It's not the performance. Instead, it's a version of reality that we distill with intention. Better data stories emerge when we appreciate the material origins of data. If we acknowledge the life that actually produced data, the real life that we can see and feel and visit, we can better comprehend abstract statistics. So some of your favorite chart types are ultimately rooted in the real world. Whenever you use a bar chart, you're really referencing a stack of stuff metaphor. And intuitively, we want to compare one stack to another stack. A pie chart is intuitively inviting questions like who gets how much is left over. And anytime you're using a continuous axis, we're really just basing the audience's understanding of the graphic on the concept of distance. How far apart are things from each other? These types of questions. So with this grounding in the real world, I want to quickly shout out the process of creating a data graphic. Whenever I'm working with data, I almost always start with a sketch. I think it's really helpful whenever you're trying to attack a problem to ask, how does my mind naturally picture this information? This information that I've collected about GWP, if I were to draw it, then what would it look like? And those sketches are really great because you can actually show them to a coworker and ask, what do you think? It's really important to pay attention to where people get lost or bored or confused before you're starting to invest your time into digital software that eases this process. Now, the whole point of doing this exercise is to hold attention. We want to be good at successful data encoding in order to achieve successful data decoding. And there are a couple of rules of thumb on how to make it happen. First and foremost, more important data should have higher contrast. It's similar to this idea that whenever you're putting together a graphic, be very intentional about an introductory point for the eye to enter. I mean, right now I'm kind of tricking you because I'm using PowerPoint animations that definitely cue you on where the eye should go. But there's other ways to do this graphically. You could literally sketch a path or arrange things from left to right, from top to bottom. Another good rule of thumb is that our eyes are really good at differentiating shape and color, but color more so than shape. So I would say whenever you're creating comparisons between things, prioritize encoding that information in color first before you move on to shape, whether it's the size of a bar chart or whether a mark is a triangle or a circle. In this process of going from encoding to decoding, a really important part is to play to the audience's interest. We want to create stories that credibly challenge what is taken for granted. Typically, that's what people remember. when they say, oh, I didn't know this. This was unexpected. I didn't know that sheetrock had to be baked in a kiln, and that is what causes it to have a higher impact as opposed to plaster on lath. I didn't know that cement also, in the process of making cement, it releases CO2, right? And ultimately, the reason for doing this is because to have a successful data decoding, we want the audience to recognize their own context in the data and help them relate to it. In a way, creating a data graphic is kind of like creating a museum visit. Your intent is to not overwhelm, but to rather guide someone through a potential graphic. And the way to do this is by layering information, just like in a museum, when you have, your little plaque, you have the big plaque, you can look at the artifact itself. On that note, text can augment, but it's not the point. We go to the museum not to read the plaques, but to actually look at the artifacts, right? So you want your data to take center stage and your captions to really play a secondary role. You want to help audiences create opportunities for return visits. If somebody were to put your graph down and come back to it in another week when it's not so fresh, what are they going to get from it? I really like this quote from RJ where he says, do not sensationalize, do not deceive, but also with your graphics, don't be afraid to entertain. Ultimately, that's what holds people's attention to the stories that matter most. So now I'm going to show you some graphs, some old, some new, and I'm going to talk about what makes them tick. So this is a really old data infographic from the 1780s from William Playfair, who's credited with inventing bar charts and pie charts. And this is showing you a comparison of populations in European capitals at the time. Things that really work about this. You'll notice that all of the numbers are rounded to two numerals. So instead of seeing London's inhabitants to the last inhabitant, we are faced with a mark that says, 1,000,000 and 100,000. Two numerals is generally a good target for holding people's attention. If you have more than two numerals, you might be misrepresenting how precise your data really is, and really people will be mentally rounding anyway to try and compare two numbers to each other. Another thing about this graphic is it's using area, right? So area is not a great thing visually to let us have really precise comparisons between marks, but it's great for rough comparisons. And in this case, it makes sense because you imagine a crowd of people standing in this circle. So again, that connection to the real world works. Here's one from Florence Nightingale, 1859. She's talking about the causes of death in wars that were ongoing in Crimea and Turkey. Interesting things about this. She's using visual grouping to lead viewers to comparisons that matter most. You're instantly comparing the size of one roundel to the other. What changed in the year 55 to 1854? The other thing that's really working about this is the biggest part of the graphic is those blue fans, right? And we read big things as important. That in this case corresponds to preventable deaths. And that's where Florence wants you to look as she's making a case for better healthcare practices in the UK and abroad. Here's one from W.B. Du Bois. He created a whole really fascinating data graphic exposition for the 1900 Paris Exposition, talking about the progress of the Black community in America after emancipation, 30 years after emancipation. Things that are still working about this really great. Headlines, super clear, legible, and specific to target audience, right? Du Bois here is translating his headline into French because that is the intended audience. The other thing is that the important part of the graphic, the big part of the graphic, is really dark, right? And that draws the eye. Lightness, as opposed to hue, so the black versus the green, reads really effectively. And you see that in the cliff drop off of percent of slaves in the United States. Here's one from Otto Neurath, 1939. He is the inventor of isotype, so like data graphics that use little marks to represent stuff. This is really kind of like a bar chart, but it reads differently, right? So a graphic talking about home and factory weaving in England. Things that are great about this, really restrained color palette. I would not use more than 5 hues on a graphic, just because otherwise it gets overwhelming. And also you see the layering, right? You could trick your eye to just look at the blue bars to talk to you about pounds of total production. You could also trick your eye to just look at the red marks to see how the percent of people in factories is increasing over time, these visual groupings are leading us as viewers to gain access to a deeper story here. And second to last, this is Bloomberg 2018, looking at how we use land in the United States. The big thing should be the important thing. It's cow and pasture range, right? Another graphic from 21 looking at the fact that we now have more anthropogenic mass in the world than biogenic mass. Layering information works here because there are callouts that lead your eye to the important numbers. And one thing I also really like about this is that this graphic respects the medium of the audience. We're probably scrolling this article and going up and down on a phone, which is why it works the way that it works. Last one. I think this is one of the most important graphics of our time, and I just learned about it when I was in Denmark because of Professor Johan Rockström with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts. This is a graphic of humanity's journey on the Earth. It's showing us delta in how much average global temperature has changed since we became Homo sapiens. And then right in the middle of the graphic, there's the Neolithic Revolution, aka the Agricultural Revolution. And then the axis breaks again to show us the last 150 years. So these kind of corridors that are established show you just how crazy the situation that we find ourselves in 2025, 2026 really is compared to what we know humanity can live in. We're truly going into uncharted waters here. And usually I would never break an axis, but in this case it works because we're talking about timescales, different scales to get it all in one graphic effectively. So how do I apply all of this? This is a graphic from last week. I was looking at an apartment layout that was using heat pump consoles versus ceiling mounted consoles, and we wanted to include embodied carbon information to make the case for simplifying our design. And here's the graphic that I presented. So things that I'm doing here, visual grouping for comparison, right? You can tell that the design options pertain to a studio layout versus a 3-bedroom layout. Contrast is the important thing. I've regrouped the data from typically the way that it's presented in one-click LCA into actually like groups that make sense for the client. The big thing is the important thing. The production of heat pump units is that big blue bar. I'm rounding all my labels so that you're reading and you're mentally kind of quickly comparing the total impacts of each design option. And I'm annotating the narrative. I'm anticipating the medium of this because someone is ultimately going to present this without me in the room. And I want them to point out the important parts of the story that, even though the 3-bedroom healing seat pump configuration requires more ductwork, that little red bar, it's ultimately worth it to go there because manufacturing ductwork is less impactful than manufacturing entire console units for bedrooms. That's basically all I have. Last thoughts. To make trustworthy work, you have to create a positive first impression. Don't be afraid to prioritize beauty. That's what holds people to the graphic. Try to strive to be correct and accurate, double and triple check. Create graphics that are accessible with multiple entry points, whether that's through color or through annotation, but be direct. Take a position that guides your audience to what you think are the most important findings. Be vulnerable, stand by your work and sign it and say, I made this and you can ask me questions. And finally, trust the audience. Don't talk down to them. They already have an experience that you may not be aware of. So let's treat our viewers with respect that they deserve. Remember, you're trying to bring some new insights into the world by mining chaos. It's difficult because it's worthwhile endeavor. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Orla.
All right. Thank you very much, Alex, for that excellent presentation. My name is Orla Smith-Lopicolo. I'm an architect and a professor at Farmingdale State College. I have worked in the private and the public sectors for about 15 years, a little more than 15 years, before I became a full-time faculty member here at Farmingdale State College. So stories are equipment for living. This is a quote by Kenneth Burke. And I think it's very pertinent for engineers. In engineering, stories are equipment for decision making. So stories surround us. We have them in our minds. We share them with our family and friends. We see them in entertainment all the time, on social media, at work, but rarely in structural proposals, technical memos, or client meetings. So let me tell you a story. When I first started teaching, I walked into a class of 30 faces, and I knew I had a task. I was used to teaching studio courses where the students were very active, but my first semester teaching here at Farmingdale, I had 4 lecture courses. And I had a freshman course, Materials and Methods of Construction 1 and 2, 30 faces staring at me, and it was a very long class time. So I'll ask you a question. Have you ever had 30 faces staring at you and you realize something's wrong? So we were talking about code, specs, sequences, risks. And I noticed the students had learning fatigue. The class was 2.5 hours long once a week. So I went back to the drawing board. And for the next class, I thought about projects that I had in my own work experience. I had a Wick's Law project where there's 4 different primes in New York State on a project, and managing that was very interesting. One, blaming each other as opposed to being under one GC. Construction document review delays, of revisions going into building departments and long delays and what you should do about it. A building that was set 1 foot over the setback line and how it has a stop work order. And then a code drive scope escalation where I had a project where we were replacing a pretty straightforward, as I thought at the beginning, concrete mezzanine on the back of a recreation center. And this mezzanine was used as a platform for people to watch over a sunken auditorium area underneath at the back of the building. So I thought about these stories and I produced a kind of a test for my 2 classes that I had in this section. So in one class, I did my usual lecture, if I normally would, for these topics. And in the other class, I wove in stories about these topics. And I tried to use the exact same amount of enthusiasm in my teaching in each to make sure that it was just the stories that were being tested. So outcomes, based on post-test comparisons. So I pre-tested the students on their learning and I post-tested them. And I also had a qualitative survey. So there was higher learning retention. The story-based group had a 26% greater retention of learning than the non-story group. There's improved engagement. Stories increased attention during the long technical lectures. There was clearer concepts. They understood the abstract code and construction topics were easier for them to grasp. They sat forward in their seats when I was telling the stories. They became more interested and more involved in the topics. Some of the topics can be very dry, even though I try to make them very exciting with writing on the board and using diagrams and graphs, similar to what Alex had just spoken about. So I noticed that there was more participation from the group with the stories. They wanted to share their stories. These classes were at night, and a lot of the students were working out in the field, and they were able to share their stories as well at the end of class. So takeaways, storytelling is not anecdotal. It's a data-supported tool that improves technical learning, engagement, and participation. You might be wondering, what has this got to do with me? Well, storytelling is going to improve retention and technical learning. Imagine what it can do in a client communication. So some data here from Stanford University. Stories are remembered up to 22 times more than facts alone. And in a Forbes survey, they found that 63% of consumers are more likely to consider purchasing from brands whose stories they resonate with. So how do you tell a persuasive story? So engineering logic, human stakes. So number 1, hook with risk. Authenticity is very important. So if you use case studies, maybe from your own prior projects, if you don't have prior projects to use, find case studies that are similar to what you're trying to sell, if you will, to your client, or within your own organization. Many times we're trying to see how an idea floats within our office, and you may need a story to help bring that to fruition with the attendees or the people that you're trying to impress with this new idea that you have for sustainability. Hook the audience, begin as close to the action as possible to grab their attention immediately. Make sure it's tangible. Make abstract concepts, for example, carbon reduction, concrete by translating them into everyday understandable examples. Two great sources, you probably heard of them off here, are stories. There's a book called How to Tell a Story, and also Talk Like TED, based on TED Talks. So two, translate to financial impact. So if you think about breaking this into different segments of how do you tell a persuasive story. So 5 on our list is product first, green second. Ensure that product or structure stands on its own merits, with sustainability acting as a compelling bonus that enhances its value. Many clients, right, will only think about the bottom line. It's important to think about how am I going to weave in sustainability so that it is an economic bonus as well. And you can see here on the side, there's a graphic from University of Delaware, reducing building costs, adding market value, increasing water efficiency, increased economic activity, energy efficient practices, and longer lasting buildings. So number 6 on our list, structure the narrative. Use a clear, logical story structure to guide the audience through the experience. If you're telling a story, it has a beginning, middle, and an end. You could start off with something that's striking and then give a little background if you have to back up, and then move forward again. Number 7, show, don't tell. So use specific descriptive language and visuals to illustrate events. Part 3 of telling a persuasive story is resolve with sustainable design advantage. So 8, embed data. Data informs decisions, but stories move them. So as Alex just showed, showing your data appropriately is extremely important so that people will understand the graphic. You know, a picture tells 1,000 words, as they say. Include emotional honesty. Evoke emotional connections through the human experience of your narrative. What was it like to be in that building after it was constructed, or that car you designed? Bring the story to a close. Ensure the ending offers a resolution, a shift in the understanding, or a takeaway message. So what's the takeaway message for your client for having this project be completed? Does it increase their market value because it is a sustainable building? Will more people want to be in that structure because it has better air quality over the lifespan, right? Or what's the overall perception of what that project is going to bring forward? So how do you explain the importance of the global warming potential to a client focused on return on investment? So another quote, engineers love features, everyone else loves benefits. So this is a building we're all familiar with, the Bullitt Center in Seattle by the Miller-Hill Partnership. And they built this building with the goal of having a 250-year lifespan. It is a concrete slab building with on the ground floor. Otherwise, it's a mass timber construction, nailed floors, and it has a plethora of sustainable features: solar panels, geothermal, very high capacity thermal envelope for retaining conditioned air. And it is a story or a building that you can use as a story. Pluses and minuses, it costs more to build. However, it will recoup its cost with 60% savings of energy costs, I think, per year. So they've seen over the first 2 years of the building from the data I saw. And over 25 years, it will recoup its cost of construction. That's a very small percent, about 1% of its total lifespan. So pay more now and the building will last longer and have lower maintenance costs as well. So reframe the story around time and money savings. For example, with the ultra low global warming potential as a bonus. So, and I'll end up here with any questions. So I will stop sharing.
All right, thank you, Orla and Alex. And if anyone in the audience has any questions, please use the Q&A box to type them in. We have about 5 minutes. So I guess we'll start with a couple of questions that I had. For Alex, how would you overlay your thinking of developing a data visualization with the structure of storytelling that Orla presented?
Yeah, so I think that we're definitely speaking the same language. To me, I particularly resonated with Orla pointing out that when you tell a story, you want to come to a close. You have to think about what is the takeaway. And that's also how it works when you're creating a data graphic. You have to sort of work backwards from what is the message that I want this client to understand to then prioritize visually which components of your graphic should be the biggest, the most contrasted, which ones should appear in the top right corners or top left corner so that it guides their eye. So I mean, totally, it's how that heat pump example that I showed you between the studio and console units, kind of different layouts. That was the process for creating that graphic, is to think about like, okay, I need this client to really understand that most of the impact is being driven by the units themselves and not by the ductwork, and that these options will drastically change depending on the layout, uh, whether we go with consoles and 3 bedrooms or not. So yeah, definitely working backwards from the takeaway.
Great, thank you. And then a question for Orla. So engineers are trained to prioritize precision and objectivity. How can storytelling be introduced without it being perceived as soft or lacking rigor?
Yeah, thank you, Brenna. So similar to what Alex just said, starting from the end result, storytelling and engineering specifically is structured as a cause effect, like logic organizing, the way you think about it. So having a clear narrative of the risk, the decision, the measurable outcome, and the rigor becomes more visible in telling the story because your data comes through with a story that will be remembered and that people will, act upon. And it really comes down to selling. If you have people in your office that are in engineering sales, they probably use stories quite a lot. So we need to look at how do we use this even in our day-to-day interactions in our offices to help us move potential ideas forward that will help sustainability and to market it with its benefits, as I said, woven into your story.
And I just want to tack on to what Orla just said. I think sometimes when we're thinking about engineering preferencing objectivity, there may be a perception that when you're working a graphic or working a story that you're cherry picking data. And that's not what we're advocating for. We don't want to misrepresent things. We don't want to break the bars in the bar chart to make a difference between two things look bigger than it really is. What storytelling is instead about is more about being intentional in how you form your information. Like as you're making your graphic, you're probably already trying to pull mentally, what is this about? And I think as good storytellers, our role is to facilitate our audience's journey along the same path. It's just to kind of respect our audience and think, you know what, these people also want to get something out of this graphic. And since I've spent so much time on pulling out information from this, from mining the chaos, I want to make it easier for them to follow my footsteps.